Okay, I'd like to call the committee of the whole meeting for Monday, March 21st, 2022 to order. Roll call, please.
Mayor Garfino?
Here.
Trustee Carroll?
Here.
Trustee Curtis? Trustee Gately?
Here.
Trustee Lowry?
Here.
Trustee Nedved?
Here.
Trustee Salazar? Here.
All right. Audience comments? Seeing none. Trustee comments? And discussion, item 1. Steve?
Thank you, Mayor. Item number 1 is regarding short-term rentals. This topic is brought up at village board meeting in the past, I believe also a committee of the whole meeting, and the board wanted to discuss what our current options are to regulate and or zone them or ban them. So we did an overview presentation at the committee of the whole on the 7th of February, and after that the village board directed staff to look into regulations or banning these uses. Since then, the village attorney and our staff have conducted research. It's a very complicated topic, so we wanted to make sure we did some due diligence. And right now, the village attorney is going to go through an overview of what we determined as options.
So I'll kind of take you through it from the beginning. You know, the first thing we looked at, and we had looked at this, I think, even a year ago, was the ability to license the practice of short-term rentals. And because we're a non-home rule entity, and as a non-home rule entity, we only have the authority to do what we're allowed to do by statute or expressly or implied from the express provisions of the statute. We don't have that authority to license and regulate short-term rentals. So the first thing that we looked at was general enforcement authority. Obviously, we can enforce the ordinances and the code provisions that we have, you know, such as noise and disturbance of the peace, traffic and property maintenance and parking and similar things like that. Obviously, we can issue citations for violations. We can impose fines. If citations and fines don't work to curb the activity, we can ask for an injunction. In order to get an injunction in court, you have to show that other methods of enforcement have been unsuccessful. So that's one option. Another option would be to look at the nuisance authority that the village has. So as a matter of common law, which is kind of pre-statutory law in a sense, every municipality has the ability to abate nuisances. We can identify a nuisance and we can abate nuisances. And our ability to do that is not subject to preemption by the state. So it's an authority that we just have by virtue of being a municipality. And similar to the ordinance enforcement parameters, basically an injunction or a mandatory injunction is the remedy for abating a nuisance. And I gave you a memo that's in the packet that kind of goes into what the factors are for identifying a public nuisance. It's a facts and circumstances analysis. So it's, there's no bright lines. There's no definitive measurement of what a nuisance is. We took a look at Naperville because they publicly took action to prohibit short-term rentals, and we assumed that they probably did it through their home rule authority, but they didn't. They actually did it through their innate nuisance authority, and they declared short-term rentals a nuisance per se. They apparently had some issues with at least one, perhaps more short-term rentals in the city. So we looked at what their support was for them determining that short-term rentals are a nuisance per se. Obviously, they had some internal issues. They also cited to an issue in a couple of Chicago suburbs where there were shootings at short-term rentals. But they really didn't have a whole lot more than that. So they didn't have any data, from a broad base, or to show that short-term rentals, consistently lead to issues in neighborhoods. So I think their approach was very aggressive, and I wouldn't feel comfortable actually taking that approach in the village. I mean, in trying to look down that road, though, we did kind of take a closer look at the short-term rental that people complained about to the board in a previous meeting. And, you know, we note that there are no citations of ordinance or code violations, and there was a total of only 3 incident reports generated by the police department as a result of complaints. One of them, there's 3 basically within the last year. One was a complaint of a suspicious person who exited a vehicle and walked up the complainant's driveway around to the back door of the short-term rental. Another one was a mother complaining that her daughter's father took her cell phone away. And another one complaining of improper parking, which turned out to be the owner who had parked in the street to shovel her driveway. So we don't have really much. It's a very thin, we have thin evidence to try to approach this from a nuisance angle. Obviously, there were some other complaints, but, you know, in the law, a complaint really isn't proof. It's not evidence that any ordinance violation or a crime has taken place unless you have a conviction or someone, you know, pleads to a charge that's brought that, you know, complaints are not proof. So we took a different angle and started looking at our current zoning ordinance and kind of looked at it from a legal perspective. And obviously the zoning code does not define short-term rentals. The code was done in 2013, which was, you know, short-term rentals were not such a big thing in 2013, so it's not surprising that we didn't address short-term rentals in the zoning code. The closest thing that we define is a bed and breakfast. And Mike looked into the one short-term rental that people were complaining about, and they don't meet the definition of a bed and breakfast. There's about 3 different criteria that we have in our definition of a bed and breakfast, and they don't meet those 3 criteria. If they did meet that criteria, and if that was the closest category where we could lump them, they would not be allowed in a single-family residential district because bed and breakfasts are only allowed in R3, R4, and ER. So if they did qualify as a bed and breakfast, they wouldn't fit. So I started poking around a little bit more, and you know, you start looking at things that you kind of take for granted and that you gloss over a little bit. For instance, Table 1 in the single-family residential district zoning category lays out all of the permitted uses and the special uses in each of the residential zoning districts. And bed and breakfasts are included in Table 1, and they're listed only as, I believe, special uses in those 3 zoning categories that I indicated, R3, R4, and ER. And obviously short-term rentals are not included because we didn't define them and we didn't really address them. But there is a statement in the introduction to the table that basically says if a use is not included in the table, it's not allowed in a residential district. So I dug a little deeper, and we do have actually a catch-all provision in our zoning code that says if we have not addressed the use at all in the zoning code, it will be allowed in an I-2 zoning district. And we did that quite a few years ago, maybe 20 years ago or more, because of something at the time that we hadn't addressed in our zoning code. And if we hadn't done that, anybody could apply for whatever it is that we didn't include in our zoning code for any district in the village. So we created it and kind of forgot about it, but it's still sitting there in our zoning code. So I dug a little bit deeper. Again, our residential zoning is prefaced by a statement that uses in residential districts should be compatible with residential districts, and it kind of goes through some categories about or factors of what is considered to be harmonious in a residential district. And as a general proposition, business uses are not harmonious with a residential district. We do have some exceptions. We have home occupations, and a bed and breakfast actually is one of the very few exceptions that we call out. So I looked at the home occupation category, and bed and breakfast. So there's one clear factor of a home occupation that a short-term rental will not meet, and that is you cannot have clients between 9 at night and like 8 in the morning. Well, obviously, a short-term rental, that's what you're doing, is you're leasing it out for sleeping accommodations. So it doesn't fit into the factors that allow home occupations. The final piece of this was we did some legal research because, when you don't have a whole lot to hold on to in the way you've addressed things in a zoning code, you go out and start looking at how the courts have dealt with these things. And we found one case decided in 2021 in the context of a homeowners association where the issue was whether a short-term rental, a VRBO or whatever it was, whether it was a residential use or a commercial use, because the homeowners association provisions allowed residential uses, it didn't allow commercial uses. And it went up to the appellate court, and the appellate court looked at, definitions because they didn't define their terms, and also looked elsewhere and found that the city of Chicago, for instance, regulates them as commercial uses. And the court decided that short-term rentals are commercial uses. Well, we also found more recently a case decided in 2022, just within the last 3 months, that's right on point. It's a zoning case. It deals with short-term rentals, and it deals with the issue of whether it's a commercial use or a residential use, and the court found also it's a commercial use. And if it's not an allowed commercial use in a residential district, it's not allowed. So the long and the short of the legal analysis is that absent the board taking some action to allow short-term rentals in places other than I-2 in the village, they're not compatible. We have not allowed them in our zoning code, and therefore they don't fit. So it turns out, we thought we were looking at a situation where the board might have to take action to try to prohibit short-term rentals if the board wanted to, or to limit them. It turns out, because of the zoning analysis, that it's actually the opposite. The board would have to take action to allow them in residential districts or in other districts other than the I-2 district. So that kind of brings us to where we are right now. We also, in the process of doing all this analysis, we realized that our hotel ordinance and the definitions of bed and breakfast and hotel and short-term rentals and how do we distinguish a short-term rental from a bed and breakfast are things that we probably ought to clean up in our code. We ought to define what a short-term rental is, and we ought to figure out where they should go in the village and under what circumstances. We cannot zone a use out of the village. We have to allow a lawful use somewhere in the village. So we can't just say, no, we're not going to zone them at all. And that's what results in the situation where somebody could apply in any district. If we basically say, no, you can't put them anywhere, the law says, no, you can't do that, so people can apply everywhere. And obviously, we don't want that. So I think we should bring this back, and we should kind of clean up the definitions and clean up basically how we deal with those things. But part of that conversation, I guess, needs to be, what do you want to do with them? And we obviously have one in the village. There may be more. There probably are more. I think there's another one in the Timber Oaks subdivision. There may be others we don't know about. I think, because they haven't been on our radar screen until, we got complaints, which is kind of typically how things go. You don't go looking for things, but, when you get some complaints, then you start looking at something. We probably, at least of those two in the village, they probably got rentals that are out, I don't know, some length of time. So, we do have some prosecutorial discretion. We don't have to hammer people immediately, but, unless the board takes some action to allow short-term rentals and within the conditions and identifying where they're going to go, I think really the only action for us to take as staff at this point is, to send letters out and say, hey, you can't do this at this point. So that's where we're at.
So if we do nothing from a zoning standpoint, we're protected, even if the use of a short-term rental isn't necessarily a possible use in the I-2. I mean, you kind of have to have a house, and how many houses do we have in I-2, in the I-2 zoning? Are we still safe, even if it's not your typical use in that district?
That's a good question. There's no definitive answer to that. I mean, as a general proposition, I would say theoretically yes. But, that doesn't mean that an argument couldn't be made that that's, clearly not the right district for those things to go into. So I think it does warrant the board looking at it and determining, assessing where they might be compatible perhaps with, in other districts within the village.
As part of that zoning review, if we were, just throwing this out there, you could also go one step further and put them as not permitted uses in residential districts too. So when you're going through that zoning process and you're clarifying the definitions and you're putting in that the I-2 is the only catch-all, you can also put that it is a not permitted use in residential districts as well.
I should add also that, obviously people rent their houses out. What I found is that, for instance, the definition of a hotel under the hotel tax provisions, a permanent resident in a hotel or in a place that has public sleeping accommodations is considered to be someone who's there 30 days or more. So, there is some, and that the same is also true of, I believe, a bed and breakfast. So there's a distinction there, and, so therefore, for instance, if somebody advertised their house for rental for 30 days or more, I don't think they would fall under the definition of a short-term rental. I suppose there could still be a question as to whether that's a residential or commercial use, but I think, common sense, I think says that we kind of have to treat that as a residential use. A lot of people rent their houses out. Sometimes those rentals go to, month to month as opposed to year or 6 months. And if we start, so there's kind of a line of demarcation there at the 30-day mark.
But a month-to-month lease is not considered a hotel, even though technically the term of that lease is 30 days.
Yeah. If 30 days or more is, and it's actually called a permanent residence in that provision of the hotel occupation tax statute.
But we could limit, my question is, then we can limit it, meaning we can make some rules where we can limit to where they can be, which maybe help us solve our issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's really the question. The question in front of the board tonight is, you have it, current zoning says that you can't have a commercial business in a residential neighborhood. And as we've done more research, Kevin's found recent cases, I think both cases were in the last year, they show you that on the court side that short-term rentals are a commercial business. So right there that says by our own zoning code, they're currently not allowed. But the delineation of what makes that a business is the 30-day provision, according to the court, Kevin, right?
Yeah.
So it's at 30 days. So anything 30 days or longer, if it's rented out 2 months at a time, 3 months at a time, it becomes a rental property. When you look at our code, the building code, the next thing we looked at is say, okay, well, is that now a multifamily residence in a residential area? Which you can't have unless it's zoned properly for multifamily, but it's not. By code, to be a multifamily residence, it has to have a delineated wall to keep that unit from access to the interior of the house. In these rentals, a lot of times, they're just parts of the house, so what they do is they put a door, but you can literally still walk, if the door was unlocked, you can walk from that rented space into the main house, like an in-law suite. So that's the issue. It's not really a multifamily by code either.
If we change the code, but we want to start enforcement based on the current code, are we shooting ourselves in the foot and admitting that our current code is not enforceable?
We actually talked about that. I think we want to be clear about the fact that we have come to the conclusion that we do not allow them in single-family residential provisions because, number one, we didn't provide for them there, and number two, it's a commercial use, and residential, especially single-family residential, are limited to residential uses and other permissible uses, and it's not a permissible use. I do think it makes sense for us to address short-term rentals because we haven't. I don't think that in itself is going to be any kind of an admission that, you know, that maybe they're allowed. It's simply that we're deciding to address them, whereas previously we haven't specifically.
We're not the only town going through this. Other towns are going through right now as you're starting to see it because our code was updated in 2013. And, you know, when Mike and I went back and forth on this, it's really easy for someone to say, well, you have a code that says bed and breakfast, and it's literally Airbnb, so that should apply as a bed and breakfast. But a bed and breakfast, the staff determination was a bed and breakfast is not, the 2013 version of bed and breakfast is not VRBO or Airbnb. Those are places you stay. Even by definition in the code, it's a place where you have someone serving you food and things like that, like a hotel. So I think, you know, Mike's initial interpretation was accurate, that it is not a traditional bed and breakfast. Then it goes into, okay, well, what do you do with short-term rentals? If it wasn't for the fact that the case law now shows that the courts state that it is a commercial business in multiple cases, I think you have something to hang your hat on because we already have the provision that says commercial businesses aren't allowed in residential areas.
I'd be in favor of sending the enforcement right now based on our current code and then bringing it back with new language to define what the short-term rental is and then define it in what section of the code, or what district.
One question has to be answered first, though, and that is the board in agreement that we are looking to ban these out of residential areas? Because that's the key.
Yes.
We wouldn't go that route if that was the
In
case.
single family, like an R1,
Yeah.
I think they should be banned in an R1 for sure. That's,
Yeah.
And we didn't anticipate this problem, and like you say, I'm extremely happy because we already have in place what we need. We don't have to worry about changing the zoning, and then that particular issue would not, you know, be grandfathered in, right? So this is the best news in terms of the current problem. And so I think that if you have R1 single family homes, that's not, like you said, it's not where you want commercial businesses.
Got it.
Okay, so with that, this is what I have. We know how to address the current issues because we have direction from the board that you want to go that route, that this is not a use you want. We already have the code in place that says we can go and enforce it. So we're going to do that, but we're also going to bring back the clarifications so we can further clarify it for future.
Yep. Perfect. Good?
Yep, good.
All right. Yep. Thanks, Kevin. Okay, item 2, Steve.
Thank you. Item number 2, I'm going to start off with is our budget overview. So every year when we do our budget, we start typically with a basic overview presentation on just the things that are in the current draft budget, things that we're looking for as we're finishing the draft budget. So at this point, the budget process is 90 to 95% complete internally, and then we bring it back to actually go through the draft budget with the board. That is tentatively slated for the April 4th Committee of the Whole meeting. Then the goal would bring it back again April 18th. If you, just in case you have questions, historically that's only if the board has, hey, can you bring this back and answer this question? Or, hey, I have a question I thought of after the review. And then the budget approval would be first week of May. Our budget year ends at the end of May. So with that being said, I will say it was an interesting process this year. We lost our finance director to another municipality as the budget sheets had just gone out and the staff was compiling everything. So first thing I want to do is I want to thank Mandy Flatt, our finance and accounting manager, who really put together a lot of the budget. She compiled a lot of the data and put it in. I worked with her to meet with the department heads early on to try to do some cuts and whatnot when we didn't have a finance director, go through it a little bit. But Mandy was she really did a lot of the legwork for this. And then Jason came on, and Jason said, what do you want to do? And I said, get to know your staff and do the budget. So he basically has been working on the budget. He's got it in a spot where he's comfortable now. He understands what's in it, so we're welcoming him here. And honestly, I'm just glad we're back on track as far as our timeline. We were worried if we'd have to push it back to end of May. It looks like we're going to be right where we normally are. So with that, Jason, please take us through.
All right, thank you. So the first place I'm going to start is general fund major revenues. I listed 6 revenues here to go through really quickly. First one, sales and cannabis tax. Seen some very significant growth in this revenue line item. Going back to the March of 2020 to June 2020, restrictions on the various businesses, sales tax in the village was probably in the mid to upper $4 million range. Once things opened back up, granted the cannabis tax is included in these numbers, we're seeing $6.4 million, $6.8 million projected this fiscal year. We're bringing it back down a little bit next year to $6,550,000, just thinking that car sales and some of the other goods that we're seeing really driving sales tax start coming back down to normal a little bit. So just trying to be conservative there. Income tax, again, very strong, $2.1 million last fiscal year. We're projecting actually $2.5 million this fiscal year, and again bringing it back down to $2,350,000 the following fiscal year. For income tax, those projections are coming off of Illinois Municipal League. They give their estimates of their per capita of just what they're seeing out, kind of in the economy. So we're really basing it off of our population times their projections for where that's going to be. So they're projecting it to come back a little bit. So we're going to see a decline there probably. Use tax. Use tax has been a very interesting revenue over these past few years, starting in 2018 with that whole Wayfair, where you started seeing use tax being charged in a lot of the online retailers. So starting in 2018, the village was seeing 15% increases in use tax each year. Up until then, 2021, with the whole leveling the playing field, where a lot of those online retailers were now having to charge destination-based sales tax. So we're now starting to see, you can see last year $762,000, and probably this year it's $683,000. So you're trying to see the use tax go down. On the sales tax side, we're seeing sales tax come in from Amazon.com, eBay. So we're directly receiving sales tax from those vendors. So kind of seeing an inverse in use tax down, sales tax up. Property tax, $2,370,000, based on the 2021 levy that was passed December. Building permits, this one seems to fluctuate year to year just based on what's going on in the village. We're going to budget a conservative number of $300,000 for next year, knowing that there's a number of projects in the pipeline that could drive that number much higher, but rather try to play conservative and see where those projects go from here. And then cable franchise fees, those have been coming in about $250,000 each year. They're really kind of trending flat or down a little bit, just maybe with the cord cutters. So we're going to budget $255,000 for next year for that. And the reason I pulled these 6 revenues versus the 40 to 45, sometimes 50 various revenues within the general fund is just these 6 alone make up about 80 to 90% of all the money that comes into the general fund. So these 6 kind of really drive what's going on in the general fund. And as I mentioned, we think revenues will be strong, probably not as strong as these past couple of years, maybe slow down a little bit. So we just want to be really conservative on in setting some really attainable targets on the general fund side. Now we'll go through personnel. Personnel historically in the general fund makes up about 75% of the total general fund budget and about a third of the village's total budget. So very big expenditure line. There are a few positions under consideration that have been added to the budget. First one, a human resources generalist. Some of these duties would include coordinating the recruitment of employees, staff training, updating job descriptions, assisting with various employee concerns or disciplinary actions. Proposed pay grade for this position would be around $67,000 to a minimum to a high of $96,000. Obviously, the person starting somewhere, in the middle of that range, probably closer. The next position, a civil engineer. This would be more of a construction management, field inspections, investigating various concerns, resident concerns. Very similar pay grade, $67,000 to $96,000, starting somewhere within. The next position would be a part-time IT assistant. So this is just, helping out with the day-to-day technology concerns with employees, just really allowing a backup and a redundancy, to give us some additional IT.
Sorry, quite frankly, on that one, we toyed around with having a full-time IT person added to assist Dave Arndt, but we decided that we would start with part-time and just see how it goes, and then if it is as labor-intensive as we think it will be, then we'll probably come back and eventually change that to a full-time position in the future. But we figured we're already asking for 2 full-time people. Let's start with a part-time and see where we can get.
So this position would be budgeted at approximately 1,040 hours. So probably right up against that 1,000-hour annual for IMRF, but not reaching that mark of the 30 hours for health insurance. So there'd be some additional benefits included with this position. And then the last one would be police record specialist. So this would be going from 2 full-time and 1 part-time up to 3 full-time. So it's increasing that part-time position. Between these 4 positions, we're looking at that it would increase the village's FTE count by approximately 2.8.
Can I ask a question about the human resource generalist? Does that person apply to the police department too? They would oversee all HR for every employee, correct?
That's correct.
So pay adjustments worked into the budget for non-union staff would be 3%. The various union, Public Works 2.75, police sergeants 3, and then the officers are currently, their contract is up in May, so they'll be under negotiation. Along with these pay increases, any employees that are eligible to move up to the next step, we're assuming they would move, up to the next step where applicable. Some additional personnel, health insurance. The renewal for the HMO plan actually came in 1.1% decrease. Medical and high deductible, 4.9% increase. Dental HMO, 2%, and PPO, 5%. So these have been worked into the budget. The village's IMRF rate, so this is the non-public safety pension plan for employees. Our current rate is 10.75%. We're assuming a percent in 2023 of about 12.1%. We won't know the actual until probably this fall. So for the time being, we have a blended rate that we're assuming of about 11.31%. And then police pension contributions, $1,443,240. This is based on the most recent village actuarial evaluation. And some just operating notes in the general fund. We're planning a tree inventory to determine the various species, condition, when to do the tree trimming. It's approximately in there for $30,000. Bridge repairs on Orchard Gateway and the Oak Street pedestrian path, $25,000. Update to the village's comprehensive plan for $15,000. Contracted police social workers, so we currently have for $10,000, I think 1 day a week. We're proposing to increase that to 3 days a week for $30,000. Some technology improvements, so these would be Springbrook, the village's financial software, and then the email server, both in-house on servers. We're proposing to not replace those servers and move them to a cloud solution. So that'll be better security, easier and faster upgrades to those services. Full funding of the village's vehicle and equipment fund transfers. I know in the previous, when there's been times for budget savings, that's kind of an easy one to kind of pull money off of how much goes into the equipment replacement fund to fund future purchases, but we're doing full funding just to not delay any money. So when vehicles and equipment needs to be replaced, there's plenty of resources there to do it. And similar to budgets in past, we are projecting a $600,000 surplus or transfer from the general fund to capital to help crew provide funding for future capital projects. Some capital projects funds, obviously the $3 million road improvement project that was approved earlier tonight. We have the Chestnut Locust Spruce road improvements. You'll see this will be tied into water main improvements on one of my next slides. So this is half of the project. We have the Public Works facility site analysis, $120,000. You'll also notice there are a few things where I say reach budgeted. So these were things that appeared in the last year's budget that for whatever reasons just didn't get done or got delayed. So they get moved. So this is essentially money that was unspent this year that we're asking to carry over to the next year. Public Works Facility Architectural Design, $500,000, again, a carryover. And then Riverfront Park improvements. This would be for the North Plaza and parking upgrades, and there would be additional phases in future years to complete the project. Route 31 TIF fund, we have other incentives to be determined, $100,000 for things that come up. And then the new United TIF fund, we have the Route 31 airport sidewalk connections, $150,000, which again, something from last year that we carried over, and we have other initiative for $750,000 for things to occur. So the water fund, we are not proposing any changes to rates for next year, so rates will stay the same. There was an increase in electricity of about $118,000. This is due to the recent bid we got for the green energy, the 2-year rate. So fairly significant increase in electricity costs for the water fund. Some capital. I know this was delayed earlier tonight, but we do currently have for the water tower engineering and construction budgeted carryover from last year. I know we're going to rebid the Well 5 improvements, but we currently have those in there as well. $865,000. Well 6 improvements, $235,000. East treatment plant transfer switch, $43,000, and then the other half of that Chestnut Locust Spruce water main replacement, $550,000. Handful of new vehicles planned for the new year, for the next budget year. 3 police Ford Explorers, $152,000. A few public works vehicles, this Explorer and the 5-yard dump. Things that were budgeted for this current year, but again, we're still waiting for them to take delivery. So this is money that was unspent in this current budget that we're rolling over to the next budget. A couple more public works trucks, Ford F-350, $45,000, and a bucket truck, $95,000. Major equipment, police body cameras. Currently, we have it in there for purchasing in the $200,000 range. We are looking at various ways in which maybe we could lease the equipment, gain some better operational efficiencies with the leasing of it. The total cost would probably be about the same, which way we go, what we're looking at now. Upgrading the facility access security system, so this would be at the police department, going through the various key cards and badge swipes. This would be kind of the first phase of a multi-year project where we come do the same thing with Village Hall, and then if Public Works ever get their new facility, we do the same thing there so that one card would work at all facilities. The leaf machine and leaf box, I think that was approved at the last meeting, so that's something that will be taking next year. Document management system, $60,000. There's a carryover from last year as well. This would be getting like a laser feature, something to where the village could scan and store all its documents and have them accessible easily online. And then network activity monitoring intrusions. So this would be making sure that there are no attacks on the village's network and things are constantly being looked at. Some other considerations, similar to how to last year, we budgeted a $600,000 transfer from the general fund to capital. With the way revenues are coming in, that number is probably being closer to a $2 million surplus. So we'll probably be coming back in the next month or so and proposing a budget amendment to transfer additional money from the general fund to the capital projects fund in this current year. Police Department Administrative Assistant, this was not requested or worked into the budget for now, but I know it's something that it's been discussed. So we may come back later this year to ask to add it into the budget if it's determined that it's needed. The planned use of the Recovery Act funds. I know the village is going to receive $2.4 million, and it's been discussed previously that the lead service line replacement was a designated use of that. We are looking into other funds or other funding sources, whether it be forgivable IPA loans or the bipartisan infrastructure law, so there could be additional money for that. So if there is, we could find a way to repurpose those funds to additional capital. I mean, go ahead.
So basically on this one, we never really obligated the funds officially. We had a conversation with the board to use it for lead service lines. We have to officially obligate the funds by the end of 2024, so we still have time. But because new federal laws came out, like Jason said, and there are loan programs that are forgivable that we are looking into, we met with our consultants at EEI to actually design a plan. There may be other funding sources that are now not only eligible to pay for lead service lines, but the restrictions that were originally put on ARPA funds have also changed. So now there are more broad categories to use ARPA funds for. So the thought process was, we know the directive from the board in our conversation was that you want lead service lines replaced, and we're working on a program for that. The question is now, if we have other funding sources available, we can also then repurpose the ARPA funds for something else as well. So we might be able to do that, which is why before we obligate it, we're looking into those programs.
And as Steve mentioned, you know, a lot of the rules change with that. I mean, I think now the standard revenue loss number you look at is $10 million. So since we're obviously receiving less than $10 million, you can essentially use the money for, you know, what they call government services or general services, which could be, you know, capital. We could use it to, you know, fund other capital sources within the village. I mean, it's pretty loose as of right now what we could use it for. It does have some restrictions on what we can't use it for. We can't just stick it in the bank and bump up reserves or pay pensions or stuff like that. But it has to be, you know, a general government use. Similar to that, determining the funding sources for future capital projects. I know we have the Public Works facility coming up. We've been very fortunate these past couple of years of being able to make, you know, multi-million-dollar transfers from the general fund into capital and really bump up that capital fund reserve, and possibly, you know, if we find other uses for these lead service lines, there could be another $2.4 million to use for capital. But going forward, looking at how are we going to pay for some of these large ticket capital items will be something to keep an eye on. And I did mention we are not proposing to change water rates for this current year, but it's something that we should probably look at in the next year or two, and just making sure that our water rates are still at least covering, if not more than covering, our operating expenses, because we're going to get into a point where if it's not doing that, then we're not putting money aside to do some of these water main improvements or these well rehab projects.
So tonight with the water tower, for instance, obviously the price of the water tower is much higher than we anticipated the project to be when we first let it out and we started the process to design it. We have a very healthy water reserve. We've only I want to say about the last 10 to 12 years, we've raised water rates once. We have the lowest water rates, to my knowledge, in the Fox Valley region by far. So it gets to a point where let's call it $4.2 to $4.4 million hit on the water tower would take a significant chunk out of our reserve. Even though we can pay for it, we would still have a healthy reserve, but at some point our general operating expenses in the water fund are actually getting to the point where they're a little bit below the revenues we're taking in. So we're actually seeing kind of a loss operationally each year. So what you're doing in that situation is you're essentially small, but you're drawing down your reserve a little by little. So at some point, we definitely have to talk about a water rate increase. And like I said before, I mean, I think the one time we raised water rates in the last 8 or 9 years, it was a small rate increase, and we actually offset it with a decrease in people's sanitary sewer rate. So people actually saw a net loss on their water bills. It wasn't even an increase on their total water bill. Something we've been proud of.
Then I know Steve mentioned earlier already the timeline here. We're very close to kind of wrapping up all the numbers, the document, so I hope to have that done in the next week or so, bringing it back for further discussion on the April 4th meeting, then the 18th if needed, then hopefully coming back with the approving the budget May 2nd. So I don't know if there's any questions or things to cover.
Yeah, I have a question. Since I've been on the board, we've added a lot of personnel positions. And I'm just wondering, how does that work with the money? Do we make more money? Are we generating more revenue to afford the additional positions? Is that the answer?
Yes, correct. So our revenues have gone up significantly. I think the biggest and most important slide you need to look at is the transfer to we have a transfer budgeted in there of $600,000. That is essentially $600,000 in surplus funding after all the expenditures for employees and everything.
From last year?
No, for this projected upcoming year. And we have historically, our revenues have jumped significantly in the last few years. We've been very blessed by sales tax revenues that have just been strong for the last few years, and they're sustainable to some degree. So when you look at that, you try to not add staff unless you know that there's a sustained funding source for it. And the truth is we were pretty conservative in the beginning. We're playing catch up the last few years, adding staff, because we're at a point now we have 65 full employees, give or take a few, and we're growing. And so the things we're getting done are things that I like to think we're being more proactive than reactive than we used to be. It used to be, you have a complaint, now we go after it. Now it's, let's head off that complaint. Let's free up people to actually do the jobs they're hired to do. HR person takes a lot of weight, let's say, off of me, the finance director, and our accounting person who don't have actual HR backgrounds. So you look at that and you say, what kind of productivity are we actually doing now? The administrative assistant for the police department, that was something that I told the chief. I said, you know what, I think that the police are always worried about making sure they have enough officers, which we've added 4 in the last 8 years. So once you get to that level, you say, okay, our streets are protected, we have adequate officers. They don't have one administrative person, and they have 35 employees in that building. So they don't have anybody to help them with payroll, they don't have anybody to help them with memo writing or any of that stuff, and the chief is doing all that. So at some point, you look at that and say, okay, we can afford to do it, we've put this off for years, now's a good time to probably bring it on.
Thank you, Steve.
Plus, I want to add, like, as far as the engineer, that saved us money. You know, sounds weird when you say, oh, you're going to hire somebody, but, you know, adding the in-house engineer saved us several $100,000 over the last few years, so there's some cost savings.
Yeah,
in that as well.
that's a great point, Mayor. The engineers, I know John is in every request for a civil engineer this year. I asked him what I'm missing about 7 times because, you know, you look at these things, whenever something's cost neutral or you're saving money potentially, you're always a little skeptical, like, okay, there's got to be some other reason why other towns aren't doing it as often. Like, why aren't there more in-house engineers? But you look at Brandon's here tonight, and he designed, when we hired Brandon, we didn't know that he was going to do the road program for sure. We thought that was a possibility. In the past, we've always hired out an engineering firm. This year's road program was done by an engineering firm designed. So call it 10% of the cost. Our average road program is anywhere from $1.5 to $2 million. So you're looking at an engineering cost of $150,000 to $200,000 for a road program annually. Brandon's salary is below that, and he's actually designed it. So this year's program of $3 million, I don't know, I mean, we assume that would be $250,000 to $300,000 in design costs that we did in-house this year. And then you get the benefit of having Brandon the other 8 months of the year that he's not designing the program. The civil engineer is the other part of the equation. So it's almost like if you have one, if you really want to see the cost benefit, you have 2. The second person is the construction manager. So that's the other component of a road program where, trying to correct me if I'm wrong, but average road program, just the road program, we spend $80,000 to $90,000 potentially on construction management. So that civil engineer would now go out there, and that would essentially be their salary for the year, would just be the construction management of the road program. It'd also be construction manager on other projects. They would help when Brandon's doing design work. They'd be doing drainage complaints, going on to people, public property, looking at curbs and things for future programs, sidewalk replacements, things that we have maybe Brian Richter, our street superintendent, doing. Now you can have an engineer going out there and evaluating our roads consistently, our sidewalks. But essentially the road program pays for both of those positions. Not 100%, but it's pretty close.
Well, you answered my question in the first couple of sentences, but thank you.
Sorry. Listen, I hear a lot from John about the engineering position. I told him at some point we're going to have more engineers than police officers.
Yeah.
Anything else for Jason?
Very good.
Yeah, looks good. Good, thank you. No exec session, motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Anybody opposed? Have a good night. Thank you.